welcome back to Bessy's channel. Today we're showing you everything about sourdough. To be honest, sourdough does take time and effort to master, but once you understand the logic behind each step, you can definitely make a perfect loaf of sourdough. The video today has 4 parts. Part 1 is the recipe, sourdough making process, as well as some tricks and techniques that you can use while making the bread. Part 2 specifically show you how to make the crust crunchy yet soft. Most of the recipes online make a very crunchy but also hard crust. We have some tips for you so the crust doesn't hurt your teeth. Then we move on to part 3. All the bakers use fancy baking tools like banneton, which is a special proving basket, special bread loom, and a Dutch oven. We're going to explain to you function of each tool and help you to understand if you need to invest in them in order to make a good sourdough bread. Last but not least, because the time and effort that required to make one loaf, I always make 2 loaves at a time. But there are only 2 of us. It does take time to finish 2 loaves. Today we're showing you the best way to store your second loaf to keep the texture and the flavor. I will also include a timestamp of each section down below in the description box, so you can easily navigate and jump to the section as you like. Let's start with the recipe. The first step has a very fancy name, autolyse, which simply just means mix flour and water together and let it sit so the gluten can start develop without kneading. In the mixing bowl, add 810 grams of bread flour, 90 grams of whole wheat flour. Whole wheat grain is packed with fiber and nutrients and provide toasty flavor, so do not skip it. Then we add 680 grams of water. While you're mixing them, remember you're not kneading the dough here. Only mix until your dough just come together and no more flour is separated from the water. After a minute or 2, once they're well combined, cover it with plastic wrap or a tea towel and let it sit at room temperature for an hour. After 1 hour, we'll move on to step 2, which is mixing the rest of the ingredients into the dough. You can see that by just mixing the water and the flour and then let the mixture sit, the gluten has developed. Then we add 175 grams of starter. In this video, we won't be covering how to make your own starter. There are plenty of videos on YouTube showing you step-by-step instructions on how to start and maintain your starter. After starter is added, we use hand to slowly incorporate the starter into the dough. Here we use a shoveling motion. Simply put your hand underneath the dough, lift it up a little bit, and then push it back in. We'll be repeating this motion for around 4 to 5 minutes. Then we cover and then let it rest for 20 minutes before adding the salt. After adding 18 grams of salt, we continue the shoveling motion for another 5 minutes until when your finger push into the dough, you can no longer feel the salt granular anymore. Then it's time to move on to step 3, bulk fermentation, which is simply fold the dough, let it rest, and then repeat. Here's a quick summary of what bulk fermentation entails. Basically, 3 sets of stretch and fold with 15 minutes rest intervals, and then 3 more sets of 30 minutes intervals. Then let it rest uninterrupted for 1.5 hours. What is stretch and fold? It's very similar to the shoveling motion. The difference is when you lift off the dough, you're trying to stretch the dough without breaking it, and then let it fall across. Repeat this motion around all sides of the dough by rotating the bowl after each stretch. And that is 1 stretch and fold round. And you will repeat the same motion for the second round of stretch and fold. By the end of the 6th set, you can see that gluten has been developed without kneading. The texture is getting stretchier and stretchier. That means you're doing it right. After the last round is done, let it rest covered for 1.5 hours. Then we move on to step 4, shaping the dough. This is the most challenging part for me because the dough is very wet. Wet dough usually is not the easiest to work with. You just have to be confident and move quickly. Move the dough to a working surface. You can lightly flour it. Then lightly flour the bench scraper as well, and then cut the dough into half. Here, I'm just eyeballing it, but if you want to be precise, you can also weigh the dough on the scale. The first step of shaping is pre-shaping. The purpose is to let the dough get used to the fact that we're shaping him or her. to an oval or a round shape. Starting with slightly fold the dough so it forms a round shape, and then lightly flour bench scraper to quickly tuck in from all sides. The motion needs to be swift or else the scraper will be sticky to the dough. Just repeat the motion all around so the tension develops across the loaf. After a while, the dough will become tighter and smoother. Then we lightly flour the top, then do the same with the other dough. As you can see, the second dough has been waiting there for a while, so it doesn't really have any shape or structure. If that's the case, we will start with folding all sides to the middle like folding a package. Once it starts to form a rounder shape, we'll do the tug and motion just like the first loaf. Once it's done, again, spread some flour on top of the loaf. Pre-shaping is done. We'll let them rest for 15 minutes. For the final shaping process, the goal is to teach the dough again to stay in its shape. We start with using the bench scraper to flip the dough so the seam side is up. Then we start to fold. First, fold the top side down to the middle, then right side to the middle, left side to the middle, and then bottom side, we will fold it all the way to the top. Then we use the bench scraper to flip the dough so the seam side face down. Then we generously flour the banneton, flip the dough before putting into the banneton so the seam side is up. We're done with the first dough. Repeat the same step with the second dough. The only difference is the second dough we're making is a rounder shape rather than the oval shape. So after we fold and flip, we'll just use a bench scraper to push in on all sides so it forms a round shape. Again, flip and put your dough in the proofing container. This time it's just a round bowl for us. Then we cover both dough using either a tea towel or a plastic wrap. Then we move on to cold proofing, which is keep in the fridge from 16 to 24 hours. Okay, believe it or not, if you're here, we're almost done. Just the final step, baking. First, preheat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Put your Dutch oven with the lid on there to preheat with the oven for at least 1 hour. Please make sure your Dutch oven can sustain heat up to 500 degrees. Then we take out the first dough from the fridge and then put it on the parchment paper. Quickly score the dough. There are a lot of ways and patterns to score your bread, so just use your creativity here. Just make sure your knife or razor is sharp and you score with confidence. The depth of the cut should be around a 1/4 inch. Then we move on to the second loaf. Again, quickly score it. After both bread have been scored, take out Dutch oven from the oven. Make sure you use the oven mitt here. Open the lid and quickly drop the bread. Close the lid and put it back into the oven. Repeat with the second loaf. Make sure you move fast here because you don't want to lose too much heat during this step. Once they're both in the oven, reduce the heat down to 480 degrees Fahrenheit and cook with lid on for 30 minutes. Then take the cover off and bake at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for another 17 minutes. Here, in order to create a softer crust, we add a tray of water. We'll discuss in details later in the video how to create a softer crust. We are done! But please make sure sourdough is fully cooled down to room temperature before cutting it. If you cut into the bread while it's still warm, you risk finding a doughy, gummy, and sticky texture, as the molecules are still dense and waterlogged. 4 hours later, let's check it out. I think this is an absolutely beautiful loaf of sourdough. I'm so proud of this. Let's check out the crust with some sound test. Time to cut it open and take a look. The crumb structure is just amazing, and inside is extremely soft. Let's have some right now. Our final and favorite step, eat it. Let me show you one of our favorite ways to eat it. Toast them for around 3 minutes. Spread with some spreadable cheese, some scrambled egg, and everything but bagel seasoning. If this is not the best breakfast, I don't know what is. Now we're done showing you how to make a perfect loaf of sourdough bread. We move on to the next section, how to create a soft and crunchy crust. Earlier stage when I started to make sourdough, despite amazing flavor and appearance, we always thought the crust can be softer, especially after 2 days. So I've been doing a lot of experiment on how to make the crust thin, crunchy, and soft. The first tip is to make sure your dough's hydration level is no less than 70%. The formula to calculate your bread hydration level is very straightforward. Total weight of water divided by total weight of flour and multiplied by 100. This recipe has a 75% hydration level, but again, if your dough hydration level is higher than 85%, the dough will be very difficult to work with. So our recommendation is to start with 70 to 75% if you're a beginner at making sourdough. The second tip is to bake with a cover for the first 30 minutes. This is to create enough steam inside your Dutch oven, hence sealing as much moisture as possible to create a thin and softer crust. Most recipes include a 15 to 20 minutes baking with lid on. Here I extended time to 30 minutes, which really makes a difference on the softness of the crust. The third tip is to bake with a tray of water for the remaining 17 minutes. As we're baking without a lid for the last 17 minutes, we still like the same steam in the oven so the crust doesn't dry out and then hardens. I have tried with and without the tray of water, and it does make a big difference on the crust. The fourth tip is extremely important. While you're cooling your bread after baking, make sure you cover your bread with a tea towel or Ziploc bag. Depending on how soft you want your sourdough crust to be, keeping the whole loaf in the sealed Ziploc bag while cooling tends to create an even softer crust because the moisture from the surface cannot escape from the bag at all. Part 3 is a very interesting section because when you watch all those sourdough tutorials online, you must be wondering how necessary it is to invest all the fancy equipment for making sourdough. What if I'm just a beginner and I don't even know how many times I'll be using them? I had the same question when I started making sourdough, and with some investigation and experimenting, here are my personal perspectives. The first is banneton. The main benefit of using a banneton is twofold. First is to give support to the rising bread. That means banneton can help to maintain the integrity of the shape. Especially a high hydration dough, the dough might spread and flatten during the final rise if they're left without anything to cling to. The second benefit is banneton can give the bread a nice pattern on the surface. If you're a beginner making sourdough, however, just start with a regular bowl lined with the flour dish towel. What I noticed is that the dough might lose structure a little bit quicker once you remove the dough from the regular bowl. You can mitigate the impact by making sure move really quickly when you score and then move the dough to the Dutch oven. The less heat you lose from the oven, the more initial burst you can get once the dough hit the hot oven, so your dough can rise upwards. To summarize, you don't necessarily need a banneton if you have a Dutch oven. The second tool is scoring lame, which is a double-sided blade to slash the top of the bread loaf. To be honest, I have not used a lame as of today, and my lame is still on the way from Amazon. So far, I've been using a sharp knife, and a lot of people just use a razor blade or a pair of scissors. As you can see, they turn out just fine. Another investment you can skip. Of course, as more advanced you're with your scoring technique and want to go for more complex patterns, you can consider getting a lame later on. Dutch oven is the one and the only item that we highly recommend everyone getting. Yes, a good Dutch oven might be expensive, but it's not only good for making bread, it's also amazing for making any sort of stew, soup, and slow-cooked dishes. We had 2 Dutch ovens even before we started making bread. It has outstanding ability to retain heat and moisture, which is critical to make great sourdough bread. However, if you really don't want to get one, here's some options I found online. Using baking stone and covered by oven-safe bowl, 2 loaf of pan stacked on each other, or 2 cast irons stacked on top of each other. All 3 ways should be good alternative to retain good amount of heat and seal moisture of the bread. Always remember to use a tray of water to create additional steam, but again, we highly recommend you invest in a Dutch oven as it is very versatile. Finally, how to store the bread. First and most importantly, do not refrigerate it. Keep it at room temperature. We found that even if we cover and wrap the bread with a towel to minimize moisture escape, the crust still hardens after 2 days at room temperature. So if you don't think you can consume within 2 days, the best way is to slice them and then freeze them. When you want to eat it, just toast the individual piece and it will taste just as fresh as coming out straight from the oven. One final little tip, if you have a sourdough sitting on your counter for more than 2 days and it has hardened quite a bit, try to use it to make French toast. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. Alright, that's it. There's so much going into making sourdough bread that we can talk for days. We're so happy to share with you guys what we have learned during this process. And if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to let us know in the comments down below. Thank you so much again for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos. Bye!